Despite my title here being Carbon Leadership Forum, I'm the data and methodology manager with Building Transparency, which means I do a lot of things, but my background is in concrete and cement. I got my PhD at C Boulder, researching low carbon concrete mixture designs.
And hi, everyone. I'm Katie Boss. I'm the program manager of procurement and policy here at Building Transparency, and excited to be here today to talk about policy. Mikaela, are you going to share, or do you want me to share this screen?
Yeah, I'll share. Nope. I said share screen too.
That was it.
That was it? Oh, okay. It didn't highlight the green. You can see it?
Yep, perfect.
Oh, okay, cool.
Okay, so if you go to the next slide, I'll just take you through our agenda real quick. First, we're just going to start with the basics of defining buy clean and really point to some of the excellent resources that CLF has on their website related to policy. Then we're going to explore some different policy structures. We'll look at different policy structures in action and see different examples globally of these different policy structures. Mikaela is going to give us a deep dive into what's going on in Colorado. We will look at EC3, do a quick demo for you and show you what kind of policy compliance filters we have there, and then wrap it up with just some looking forward. What do we expect to see in the world of policy? And then hopefully we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Next slide. So just to start off, I did want to make sure, especially since this is a CLF webinar, that you all were aware of all of the resources that are on CLF's website. They have something called their policy toolkit. There are several different PDF documents that really go into what is a buy clean policy. I've included the definition there on the left. I won't read it for you now, but if you're interested at all on this topic of policy and you want to learn more about this, I strongly encourage you to go check out the policy toolkit and read deeper into the subject. Next slide. And one of the features of the policy toolkit I really love is this interactive map. This is just a snapshot of the United States, but they have they're tracking policy globally. And it's interactive, so you can click on one of those little pins there and it'll pop up with a short description of the policy. It'll say if it was proposed or passed, if it's a state or local or national level policy. So really excellent resource. So thank you to the people at CLF who manage that and who created that. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about policy structures. Next slide. And according to the CLF Policy Primer series, there are three primary components of a buy clean policy. These are disclosure, standards, and incentives. So I think number one, requiring disclosure is, of course, a critical component to any policy. As the old saying goes, you can't reduce what you don't measure. And most policies are requiring disclosure via product-specific EPDs or environmental product declarations. If you're not familiar with these are essentially a summary document that summarizes the results of an LCA and discloses the environmental impacts of manufacturing a building material. One of the environmental impact indicators on an EPD is a metric called global warming potential, or GWP. That's the metric that we associate with embodied carbon. The second component of a buy clean policy are related to setting a performance-based standard. This is essentially where the GWP limit will be defined. Now, typically, policies will establish a GWP limit, which applies to a group of similar products or the same material. And it's important to note here that a good standard will not dictate how a manufacturer meets that target. We certainly don't want to stifle innovation. We want to maybe set a limit, but not tell the manufacturer how to get there. And then finally, as it relates to incentives, policies can use incentives to encourage voluntary participation, support implementation, or reward high performance. And examples of incentives could be things like providing financial support via tax incentives, technical support and training, or preferential purchasing, such as bid incentives. Next slide. Click once. So the first type of policy that we'll talk about today is at the project level or whole building level. I will say that this is more common in Europe. I think there is increasing interest in this here in the United States, but essentially what this does is it sets a GWP limit for an entire project. For example, in ILFI's zero carbon certification, their embodied carbon limits, you cannot exceed 500 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter total built area. So what this does is it essentially aggregates the impacts of each material at a project level, and it does incorporate the actual volume of each of those materials that are used. Next click. Next is just probably the most common approach here in the United States, and that's the product level. And essentially what this does is it defines a maximum GWP limit, again, for an individual product or group of like materials. For example, you could set a limit of 290 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per cubic meter for 3,000 PSI concrete. This is probably the most simplified reporting approach. A contractor could demonstrate compliance simply by providing an EPD that states that the 3,000 PSI mix they used was less than 290. And again, this is the most common approach here in the US, but if you click once more, there is sort of a hybrid approach that is increasingly common in the United States, especially for materials like concrete. So what this is this is a volume weighted average. You might hear the term carbon budget. And essentially what this does is, for example, for the concrete on a given project, you could multiply the volume of your 3,000 PSI mix by the GWP limit. So let's say it's 290. And you would tally up those numbers for each mix. So multiply your volume by GWP limit, volume by GWP limit. That would give you one number. So for example, on a given project, your concrete scope may not exceed 1.5 million kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent for the whole project for that material. What this does is it allows flexibility for supply chain variations, for schedule impacts or schedule delays. So even if a ready mix producer, exceeded the limit a little bit in one mix, they could make up for it in other areas. Next slide. And where could we see these GWP limits appear? First and foremost, oftentimes we'll see a city or a jurisdiction create a climate action plan. Now, these climate action plans might not specifically define GWP limits, but they will point to the need to address embodied carbon and highlight the need for legislation or policy related to embodied carbon. And then where we see the rubber meets the road is where actually legislation is proposed. And what I've included on the right here is a screenshot of the Buy Clean Colorado bill, House Bill 21-1303, which Mikaela will talk about later. But essentially, you could see legislation being proposed. That's where you'll see actual GWP limits, or at least the call for GWP limits to be established. And then maybe the state DOT or the state architect or the Department of General Services will actually establish those limits. And then those limits would appear in the public building specifications. There are also private developers who are establishing their own policies and putting GWP limits in their project specifications, ideally directly in the material specification, but sometimes you'll see embodied carbon requirements in, say, the Division I Sustainable Design Requirements spec. And then finally, there's seems to be more and more activity related to GWP limits and embodied carbon language in the building code. All right, now I'll pass it over to Mikaela.
Okay, nice. So another thing we wanted to outline high level that we're seeing in terms of policy is how limits are being set once a limit is determined to be needed. And there's kind of two main methods that we're seeing out there, which are via industry average EPDs setting the limits, or using the available spread of EPDs from a database like EC3 as a measure of the spread. And then setting the limits according to that spread. So In terms of limit setting with industry average EPDs or LCAs, here I've listed as an example the NRMCA national benchmarks for each strength group, and as well as the industry average EPD value for fabricated hot rolled structural steel sections. And this is just an example of using industry average values to set limits. They're created by surveying manufacturers and contributing, those manufacturers contributing to the industry EPD via production quantities. And so we also just wanted to highlight kind of how we see, the pros and cons of both of these strategies. So the pros of setting a limit with an industry average EPD is it's expected to be representative of the market because it is production weighted. It's directly coming from manufacturers and their information. On the drawbacks side, really the industry average is the only available number in terms of statistics that you could use to set your limit. So if you wanted to be a little more lenient or a little more conservative in terms of your limit setting and what your priorities setting the limits are, you'd really only be able to use a multiplier at this stage, as opposed to kind of choosing something like the 75th or 80th percentile of the market. In a similar vein, you're limited to basically the material types and the geography of the industry average as it is reported, as well as the timeline with which it is updated. And basically the quality is dependent on industry participation. So, just making sure that there aren't too many sectors or parts of the market that you're considering that are left out of calculating that industry average value. But I wouldn't want to the representation and production weighting is a significant pro of this method. And so example of this policy type is Bike Lane California. That's for the material categories that they're considering using this policy limit strategy. Like I alluded to, the other option we're seeing is limit setting with the available spread of EPDs. And so just as an example, again, I've created this graph that shows the GWP ranges as a box plot for normal weight ready mix concrete EPDs, specific to Colorado, just because this is CLF Rocky Mountain. And I've binned it out as you might for different strength classes. And that's, shows the range or the spread of global warming potential on the y-axis for the EPDs in each category. And then, wanted to highlight the pros and cons of how you might set a limit with this kind of data. The pros are that it's more customizable to needs, right? So it could be regionalized. It's not reliant on the publication of an industry average for whatever desired categories you need. And you can also use different statistics depending on your preference. So you're not limited to the average, basically. The cons are that it's basically the opposite, cons and pros. It's not production weighted, and really you don't know the representativeness of EPDs that are currently valid. So there's the potential for skew, that sort of thing. But just wanted to highlight these two strategies that we're seeing. An example of this policy type is how the U.S. General Services Administration has adopted their interim low embodied carbon material requirements. Okay, back to Katie for policy structures in action.
So now we'll just talk you through some real world examples of some of these structures. Starting with Europe, as I mentioned, it is more common in Europe to take a whole building approach. I saw a question in the chat and we can maybe address that later, but They've got a longer history related to embodied carbon policy. The Netherlands established a decree in 2012 that required all buildings larger than 100 square meters to conduct a whole building LCA. And between 2012 and 2030, they're implementing gradual reduction requirements and hoping to achieve a 50% reduction by 2030. The European Commission established the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and that will also require calculation and disclosure via whole building LCA for new construction starting in 2027. So that one has a couple years before implementation. And then I included this one from France, which I thought was interesting. This is specific to housing and was enacted in January 1st of 2022, but it requires documentation of both operational and embodied carbon, and there's an incentive for the use of bio-based materials such as hemp, straw, and timber. Next slide. So I mentioned each of those policy structures earlier. We'll start with the product level, which Mikaela already mentioned, but Buy Clean California was one of the first Buy Clean, if not the first Buy Clean policies here in the United States. It was passed in 2020. And it applies to state-funded public projects in the state of California. They established individual product level GWP limits for flat glass, reinforcing steel, structural steel, and mineral wool board insulation. Next slide. Now, getting back to that project weighted average I mentioned earlier, the city of Portland sort of took a hybrid approach, and this policy applies to city-funded public projects that are greater than $500,000. It applies to ready-mix concrete, and it just went into effect in January 1st of this year. So what they did was they first just started by collecting EPDs, and they wanted to evaluate where they were at with the city-approved mixes that they were already using as sort of a benchmarking exercise. They then established a committee with representatives from industry, from ready-mix suppliers to contractors to designers. Of course, city officials were involved, and they all met as a committee to review the data that was collected and establish the agreed upon GWP limits. I believe they ultimately landed on the NRMCA Pacific Northwest regional benchmarks, but not before they collected data to make sure that that was an appropriate starting point. Now, they do have the product level approach where you can simply meet the GWP limit of each individual mix, but they also have an alternative compliance pathway with this volume weighted project average. So again, in the event that a ready mix producer, for whatever reason, exceeds the GWP limit in one mix, they can make up for it in another area and still be in compliance. Next. And then finally, from an incentive point of view, this one was recently passed just in January of this year in New Jersey. I believe LECLA stands for Low Embodied Carbon Cement Concrete Leadership Act, something like that. I'm sure I butchered it, but you can Google it and learn more about it. But this applies to state public projects that are greater than 50 cubic yards of concrete. And what it is it's essentially a tax incentive. So if the Portland cement content is reduced via the use of supplementary cementitious materials, or if the GWP of the mix is reduced by energy efficiency strategies at the plant, the producer can get a 5% tax incentive on their project. They are also able to get an additional 3% if the concrete or cement utilizes CCUS, so carbon capture, utilization, and storage in some way. So this is a total up to an 8% tax incentive, which is pretty groundbreaking to see this happen in New Jersey. And I think they're exploring other states to introduce this in. Next. And then just looking at the timeline of events related to what's been happening on a federal level. In December of 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 14057. And that same year, the Federal Buy Clean Task Force was launched. Then in March of last year, in 2022, the GSA issued its first Buy Clean standards for concrete and asphalt, which are product level limits product level GWP limits that require product specific EPDs to be submitted to for compliance. And then in August of last year, Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act. This allocates $4.5 billion to federal agencies for the procurement of low carbon construction materials, but also towards disclosure, such as for manufacturers to pursue EPDs and for the development of PCRs. Now, earlier this year, the EPA has hosted a series of webinars. They also issued a formal RFI, and they wanted to collect feedback from industry on how they should prioritize the distribution of this funding. And I know CLF and Building Transparency and a few others submitted a response to that RFI. And then we anticipate that in Q4 of this year, or perhaps Q1 of next year, the first round of funding from the Inflation Reduction Act for EPDs and PCRs will hopefully be distributed through an EPA grant program. Next slide. Then I just wanted to briefly talk about how Building Transparency has been involved in policy. Primarily, our executive director, Stacy Smedley, has been involved in this quite a bit. But essentially, if there is a policy that is proposing any kind of embodied carbon limits, we can support just collecting data related to informing that language. So we can scrub the EC3 database, and this is something you all could do as well on your own, just to see how many EPDs are available in a certain area for a certain material, what the range of GWP is for a given material in a given location. And we've done some custom queries and scrubs of the data for different policies. We also just generally advised on approaches to low carbon procurement policies, and also support implementation via the use of EC3 and policy filters, which I'll show you later. And then specific to the Inflation Reduction Act, we supported modeling of emissions reduction targets and financial needs and projections. Next slide. And then here's just a map to outline some of the places we've been involved with policy support. Next slide.
Okay, great. I will now do a little bit more of specific highlight of Colorado policy. I'm going to talk about Buy Clean Colorado and the Denver Green Code. So giving high level kind of an outline, Buy Clean Colorado is highlighting kind of at the level that we were talking about before with, is this policy mandatory? What is kind of is it product versus project level? How are limits being set? I wanted to kind of outline that. So, for Buy Clean Colorado, yes, it's for all public state funded construction projects. The strategy has been going at the direction of product level, and the limit setting is not yet final. But I did want to highlight that it's separated into two distinct programs for vertical and horizontal construction via the two distinct statutes. So the Office of the State Architect, or OSA, is handling the program for vertical construction projects, and Colorado Department of Transportation, or CDOT, is handling the horizontal construction. And so that means there's actually distinct timelines and scope coverage of both of these. So as we're kind of seeing, as Katie and I both talk, it's a lot of information, and there's a lot of different directions that things are heading. So it's a lot to keep track of, but wanted to put it all in one place for everyone. So for the Office of the State Architect, some information is out there about how this will be handled. Projects will be subject to limits for anything $500,000 or greater. There's quite a few materials listed for vertical construction. So there's asphalt and asphalt mixtures, cement and concrete, glass, post-tensions, concrete, reinforcing steel, structural steel, and wood structural elements. But as some other policy has been seen to do sometimes when certain material categories are not ready, the data is not developed enough. Sometimes those limits have been scratched, so that may occur. But the timeline of this is starting on January 1st, 2024. EPDs will be required for all eligible materials and must be below the limits. Oh, I changed the, it's for public projects that initiate design solicitation on or after January 1st, 2024. And these will be, like I said, at the product level. The limits are not final, but OSA is directed to set limits at the industry average GWP for each material. So you can kind of guess the direction that that's going. And then for the horizontal construction, Colorado Department of Transportation is considering state-funded projects that are greater than $3 million. The materials listed are different, and the way they're going about the limits is also slightly different. So it's going to be considering asphalt and asphalt mixtures, cement and concrete mixtures, and steel under the bid item categories that align in the table here. And so there's actually quantity limits. If you're below that limit, you don't have to submit an EPD. So it's just to be a little more, let's get the low-hanging fruit that's of high quantity here. The timeline is also different, so compared to OSA. So winning contractors must already submit EPDs starting on or after July 1st, 2022. They need to submit EPDs for applicable bid items. These currently have no global warming potential limits, but so it's just collecting EPDs right now, and that is informing the limit setting process. So by January 1st, 2025, contractors will need to submit EPDs under the applicable limits that will be coming out. Like I said, that this will be also at the product level, and the limits are not established yet. Okay, so I'll move to the Denver Green Code, which is highly localized to us here. So this is applicable to all building projects in the city of Denver, except for residential buildings. And each project is required to adhere to a specific number of provisions from each code chapter. So not all of the Denver Green Code has to do with embodied carbon. But the one that is applicable here is Chapter 9, which is materials and resources. And that's really where we're seeing embodied carbon limits enacted. So the materials that are listed are ready-mix concrete, structural steel, and reinforcing steel. The timeline is actually that it's just started. May 1st, 2023, EPDs need to be submitted for these materials. And the limits are product level, but also with the possibility of being project level volume average, as Katie mentioned. So it's an either or. So you can either adhere at the product level, where the concrete limits are set at the 50th percentile product specific EPDs when they develop these limits. And the steel limits are set at 150% of AISC's industry average EPDs from 2021. So it's actually kind of a combo in both sense, product level limits or project total limits, and the limits are being set in two different styles. So I would suspect that that is because of steel's product specific EPD availability. And then I just added as a slide that you don't need to read right now, but if you wanted to reference later, the exact limit numbers and how that's structured. So for the Denver Green Code, the ready mix limits have categories of kind of this normal ready mix, high early strength, or lightweight concrete under the different compressive strength levels. And then for steel, broken up by structural sections, hollow structural sections, plate, and rebar. Okay, back to Katie.
Okay, I'm gonna steal the screen
Oh yeah.
and walk you guys through EC3. So if you've never been to EC3 before, you can go to buildingtransparency.org and create a free account by clicking register free here. I'm going to sign in. Okay, so this is the main dashboard of EC3 when you log in. I'll just walk you through a couple of the features here. The first thing you'll see is this heat map of EPDs. So what this shows us, and you can toggle between concretes and non-concretes, it'll show you how many product-specific EPDs we have in the EC3 database globally. You can also zoom into the United States here, Europe, and see some different variations of how many EPDs we have in the system. And then over here on the left, if you're not familiar with EC3, it serves two primary functions. One is that is a public free database of product-specific EPDs. And the other component is what we call the building planner. And you can essentially quantify the upfront embodied carbon emissions, so stages A1 through A5 of individual building projects. I'm going to show you guys find and compare materials. This is how you would search for an EPD in your area. Let's go to concrete, ready mix, and click next. Then what you'll see here are a lot of different performance specification filters that you could search by. Let's say I want to see how many product-specific EPDs are in the state of Colorado. I can navigate using the tree, or you could just simply type in Colorado here if that's easier for you. And then click OK. And let's just say I want to search for 4,000 PSI mixes in the state of Colorado. I'm going to click search. It may take a few minutes. We have an ever increasing number of EPDs in the database and has to scrub through a lot of data. Okay, so the first thing you'll see pop up is this box plot and whisker chart. What this is showing us is it's showing us the range of GWP values for the EPDs that match my search criteria. So for 4,000 PSI mix in the state of Colorado, the GWP, and it's not a lightweight aggregate mix, the GWP values range from a minimum of 141 to a maximum of 468. Those are essentially what we would consider outliers. You'll see this green box here, the average value, and this is the 80th to 20th percentile, but the average range of GWP values is between 220 and 293 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per cubic yard. Now, one thing you'll notice here is this compliance dropdown. And as you see here, we just recently implemented a filter for FEMA, for the Inflation Reduction Act incentive-based funding. The way FEMA approached it was a little bit different from GSA. They opted to go with the industry average values as their limits for the IRA incentive funding. So for FEMA projects that are pursuing some of that Inflation Reduction Act funding, they're using 3,000 PSI mix of concrete. And let's assume that this project is in Colorado. I'll click on that filter and then click search. And what should appear, it looks like there are no EPDs that meet that filter limit condition. Let me go back and I'll show you guys by clean California, because I know we've got some that meet that criteria. But let me just, I failed to scroll down to show you what appeared below, just for those of you who haven't used the tool yet. So what this shows me is that there are 365 product-specific EPDs in Colorado for a 4,000 PSI mix. You can search by manufacturer, you can search by plant, product, you can sort from lowest to highest GWP. There's a number of different things you can do to search for different products in your area, and all that information appears here. There are also the industry average EPDs in the system, such as the NRMCA industry-wide EPD and benchmark report. Okay, let's go look at steel, rebar, for example, and I'm going to filter to California and show you guys the Buy Clean California filter. So I've navigated to California, click this compliance dropdown, and I'm going to click on Buy Clean California 2020 and hit search. And it looks like there are no EPDs that meet the limit. Sorry, guys, I should have checked this before. But in theory, what would appear are the EPDs that meet that GWP limit. Let me try the 2022. Nope. Let's see. Let me try one more thing here. So what I've done is just navigated to hot rolled sections. Nope. So that is how the policy compliance filters work. So if we were to incorporate, for example, the Denver Green Code limits or eventually the Buy Clean Colorado limits, we could do that. So once you do hit that compliance filter, you would be able to see the EPDs in your area that meet the limits per the policy. All right, Mikaela, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Sorry, I was in the middle of responding to chats here. Okay, multi-functioning. Okay. Okay, so the last thing to talk about is just kind of what we think about moving forward with all of this policy. And it's all being, it's also new right now, but we also know there's lots of ways that things will be improving in the future and lots of considerations out there. So just wanted to highlight a few additional considerations that we're thinking about. One of those, I would just kind of, lump several things into the bucket of data and improved data quality. And underneath that, good quality data associated with setting limits, and also good quality data associated with EPDs that are going to comply with limits, right? So within that, one thing that we kind of see in the US, especially with policy that is tending to be product level, is this issue with functional appropriateness and equivalence to a limit that's being set. So I like to use concrete examples, though many material categories are applicable here. But for example, we know that a 3,000 PSI concrete encompasses a wide variety of different types of concretes that may have a variety of fresh and hard state other performance parameters. So what I'm trying to get at is that we need limits to be set that in which we ensure that the EPDs that are abiding by those limits are functionally equivalent. So we may need more bins to basically ensure that there's reasonable comparison there. The other idea under high quality data is ensuring that upstream, it's associated with upstream supply chain data. So what I'm thinking of is for these materials where we know that upstream in the supply chain for that product, the supply chain has high global warming potential and high variability in GWP. So we know that we need specific upstream supply chain data to be passed down through the supply chain so that average values are not being used. So for concrete, that's the upstream carbon intensive material is the cement, and we know that we need supply chain specific data for that cement. So it's just a process of how do we incentivize that through policy, and how do we ensure that there's transparency of that data through the supply chain. The last bit that I'll talk about associated with good quality data is what's brought up to us frequently associated with highly regionalized materials and products, and the need for regionalized data to be abundant and limits to be regionally appropriate. And so I've just put a screenshot of the NRMCA, the National Ready Mix Concrete Association's regions that they produce industry average benchmarks for. And you can see the states in each region encompass, 4 to 10 or more states. And I do believe that they are working on even more highly regionalized benchmark values for their, as a possibility for their upcoming report. But it just kind of speaks to moving from national averages for highly regionalized products to more nuanced regional numbers. And then, so the second consideration bucket, I suppose, is speculation on things that will happen associated with policy that we don't know will necessarily happen, but are things we need to consider. So policy right now is typically using EPDs that are cradle to gate, so A1 through A3. And right now, I don't know of any policies that include consideration of global warming potential from the transport, so A4. And what would not be awesome is if, things that are procured with low carbon really far away have to get transported many times across the country to fulfill procurement needs for different policies. So I think one thing that should in the future be considered is A4 and real A4, not just an average. And then just wanted to highlight the possibility, and something we want to avoid ideally is what I would call leakage or sometimes burden shifting, where if, for example, a policy incentivizes states to procure low carbon concrete that uses up all the supply of fly ash in the US, but simply the burden of not using that fly ash gets put elsewhere in the private sector, is something that we would ideally want to support not happening via policy. So I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but something we want to keep our eye on. Yeah, and happy to get any discussion going on considerations like this. So that is all we have, and we can open it to Q&A for the last 10 minutes. Wow, we really hit it on the head.
I figured out what I was doing wrong on the demo. I need to redeem myself and show you guys real quick. This, the FEMA IRA compliance filter for structural steel. So we have a known bug with the geography that our developers are working on fixing. So I just didn't narrow the geography at all and just left it at global. So as you can see here, when I search for product-specific EPDs for hollow structural sections, we have 61 product-specific EPDs. And then if I go to the FEMA IRA filter and hit search, now we have 14 EPDs that are compliant. And one thing I did want to note that you see it defaulted to showing the reported GWP from the EPD. Typically in EC3, what you'll see here is the uncertainty adjusted GWP. So one thing we were able to do, because the FEMA limits were based on reported GWP values, we made sure that that was the default, default GWP that appeared in the search results. So just wanted to show you guys the filter in action.
Thank you, Katie, sorry. We have, I think Mikaela has been responding to almost all the questions. I think there is a second part of Alexa's questions about the European trend of doing the building GWP limits versus the product GWP. I think you answered part of the question, Katie, but there is a little part of like, what do you think is most effective approach? And So it's not to put you on the spot, but if you have a preference.
I think that's a
It's all
tough
pros, cons.
question. Yeah, there's definitely pros and cons to each. I would say that the product level, and maybe the reason why the US has kind of gone that route towards the product level approach is, again, that simplified reporting. For a whole building LCA, that takes some kind of expertise. It takes a tool. It takes, I think, more knowledge of embodied carbon and expertise involved in reporting to meet the requirements of that approach. But on the flip side, I think that it is important for the volume of materials to be incorporated. I think it's important for the whole building to be addressed, for embodied and operational carbon to be addressed. So I think the ideal state is that we would shift more towards the whole building approach. But for now, I think that the product level limits were a good starting point. You know, we had to start somewhere.
I think too, with the whole building level, there's so many questions. We didn't even talk about biogenic carbon and wood and everything. And there's just so many questions remaining about how to set limits and good policy that come up in different ways. If you're setting different policy in different ways, you come up with different drawbacks. So.
True. I completely agree. So there is a question from Johnny, and I think this group is small enough that if you all don't mind, just turn your cameras on. And Johnny is the one that I want to ask the question if you're able to. If not, I can ask it for you, but you put it on the chat. Feel free to just turn your camera on or just unmute yourself and ask the question if you're still here with us. Maybe not. Oh, there she.
Hey. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey. Thanks so much, y'all. It's been a really great presentation. My question is for someone had mentioned early on that there might be potential funding for manufacturers looking to complete their EPD. Correct me if I'm wrong in this. I was just kind of looking for that information again.
Yeah, I don't know the exact website, but what I've done, the EPA is the one who will be sort of announcing when that funding is available and how manufacturers can pursue that funding. That the specific details have not come out yet, but I'll see if I can find the link to subscribe to their email updates and send that to you. If you could just drop your email address in the chat, I can follow up with you.
Yeah, that's no problem. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
We're also seeing, and this is very specific locally and to a particular material, but it is coming out that for example, in Massachusetts, there's a grant program right now going on for ready-mix concrete producers, incentivizing them to create EPDs with, if you make 5 EPDs, you can get, I think, $3,000 per EPD, something like that. But grant programs like that from states upcoming now too. I would anticipate that happening elsewhere as well.
Jamie, do you have a question you will like to ask? No? Well, thanks for turning your camera on and hi. If nobody has a question, I do have a question. How long does it take to add those limits to EC3 tools? So whenever the Buy Clean Colorado GWP limits come out, which I think Bailey, if she's still around, she's not, but she was mentioning that it will be sometime this summer. How long should we expect before they are available to all of us for compliance?
Well, so yeah, it's a good question. I've talked with Bailey, and it's great that she's a co-chair because now I have like easy access to chatting with her and being like, how do we get these in EC3? I reached out, and it sounds like it's going to be even the release in June of the limits for OSA are going to be draft, and they preferred that we not add them to EC3 at this point. So they were like, well, let's wait till they're final. Maybe we can move them on that needle in the future. But the timeline for us is if we're on top of it, we can get them in as they are released. But we're obviously prioritizing things like federal, state, by clean limits, and then getting to highly regionalized ones as well.
Yeah, I'd
And
say
is
for
there,
FEMA, sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say for FEMA, once they released their memorandum saying they were going to point to the industry-wide EPDs, it took us, I think, 6 to 8 weeks on the development side to get them implemented.
Great. And is there an expectation, a desired expectation? I mean, expectation from me, for example, yes, of having a report similar to LEED, procurement of low carbon materials, or like something that says I enter all my quantities and everything for my project, and it says, yes, you comply or not.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. We have been talking to some different states and entities about customized reporting for policy compliance. That's not necessarily available in the public feature today, but if a state or at the federal level wanted to explore a custom report, we could certainly talk to them about that.
Great, thank you. We have a minute left, so if there's any comments or questions, feel free to also add anything else that you have experienced on your work and it will be applicable to this conversation. Feel free to jump in and add, or silence forever.
Victoria, should we send out we'll send out the recording will be available. Should we send out the slides as well if people are interested in particular? I don't know if you want to do that.
It's up to you. We normally don't send the slides. We just make the recording available,
fine, yeah.
but it's,
Cool.
yeah. If anybody really wants the slides, please
Speak now if you want
send us
that.
or send us an email and we'll coordinate that. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Katie and Mikaela, for the presentation and for being with us today. And thank you all for participating. And coming up, Dorian, if you want to jump in and just mention briefly our next webinar.
Yes, so our next webinar will be on August 31st, and we will be having Alexis from KLNA speak about some projects where she has used recycling of various materials, and she might do a few case study specific stories and explanations, and share more about her experience with reuse and circular economy practices.
And she is here right now, so if you have any request, please speak up and let her know what you want to learn about. Thank you. Thank you all for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.